Hey, welcome to the Rain and Morale podcast. So do you ever feel like screaming out in the office, on Zoom or outside the school gates, for the love of God, come on, really? Then if this is you and you're looking for an honest, fun and frank podcast on life and business, then sit back and listen to me, Rain and Morale. I'll be bringing great people on the show to talk, share and debate their life experiences and business challenges, keeping the show unpolished, but in a fun and unique British style, with sarcasm, tenacity, maybe a few swear words or tears. This podcast keeps it real, honest, raw, and removes the bullshit in the only way I know how, through authenticity and getting shit done. Think of it less like the Housewives of New York or Towie with the lipo and drama, and more like the house lives of the real world. I hope you'll take something away to be better informed, laugh, smile, or maybe even finally getting the confidence to shout, come on, really. So enjoy. Erin, welcome to the Rain and Morale podcast. How are you?
Hi, I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're most welcome. So just as a brief intro for the listeners, Erin Remblance is based in Sydney and is an amazing mum of three. She's a freelance writer and is currently studying wellbeing economics. And I've been following Erin for quite some time on LinkedIn, and I've really kind of just felt a connection there between what you were saying, the tone of voice and etc. So I'm delighted to have Erin on the show today. And we're really going to address and just have a conversation around degrowth and what that means and is it possible. So Erin, over to you. Maybe we could start with a little bit more about your studies in terms of the wellbeing economies, and then we can dive into degrowth.
So I am worried about my internet connection, so let me know if it's unstable. Sorry about It's fine. So I sort of became aware of the climate crisis. It's always been there, it's always been in the background, but I really started paying attention to it about 3.5 years ago. And I was reading an article. My youngest child was really small and I was trying to get her to sleep. And I was reading an article just after the release of the last IPCC report, or it wasn't the last one, it was the special report into 1.5 degrees of warming. And I was reading it and I was just like, holy moly, how on earth is this not a bigger deal? Like, this is really bad. And it was sort of from that point on that I made a decision that I can't just keep ignoring it and that I have to face into it. And sort of it's a conscious choice every day to choose to care about it, because you could easily live your life, and I'm sure many people do, and not worry about climate, because it doesn't really touch until you have a massive flood near your home or a fire near your home, which has happened lately in Australia. It doesn't touch your everyday life. So it was through my involvement in climate that I became aware of the role of our economy in perpetuating the crisis, and looking at other ways that we can, look and like live on this planet that concentrate more on well-being than just sort of constant economic growth. So it's been something I've been actively looking at and studying for maybe 12 months or so.
Awesome.
Just trying to connect the dots.
Yeah, and I guess, like you say, actually, sometimes when you start, and it's similar to me, when you start to delve into it and look at all of the challenges and the truths, it can become very overwhelming to the point where sometimes it might be easier just to ignore it and carry on. So I know we want to talk about degrowth. So in your kind of definition, what does degrowth mean?
So degrowth, it's a planned reduction in material footprints, which includes energy, so that we are back within the planetary boundary.
Yeah.
So there are confirmed that we're exceeding 6 of them already, and there's one being peer reviewed as being exceeded as well. So it's sort of this contraction of the economy so that we can come back into what our planet can handle. It only applies to wealthy nations. It obviously doesn't apply to countries that are kind of living well below what there's sort of like a pro rata of what each country can consume each year before it starts exceeding the planetary boundaries. And not every country exceeds them, obviously, but there are certain wealthy nations such as Australia and the UK and Canada and the US and France, and there's 120 countries or so that are currently exceeding planetary boundaries, and it's just bring those economies
exactly
to what the planet can handle each year.
Exactly. And I think a lot of the developing countries are living on less than $1 a day, and they really aren't the ones that need to kind of embrace and drive that change.
No, and when you sort of drill down into the numbers and start seeing where the climate crisis is being driven, the wealthiest 10% of people are responsible for 52% of greenhouse gas emissions, and the poorest 50% of people are only responsible for something like 7%. Like, this is not a human-driven problem; it's a consumption-driven problem, and so which is reassuring. That's something we can change. That's something we can all do something about easily. So from that point of view, that's really reassuring. It's there's some wonderful inequality at the moment around the world, and once we wealthy nations start to come back in within planetary boundaries, it gives space for, I don't like the term developing nations, but I'll use it, developing nations to start to grow, so that globally we're all within the planetary boundaries, but their quality of life is improved. So there's lots of things to like.
Yeah, massively. And I think, like you say, the developing nations more often than not already have the wealth. It's just that it's been taken from them. So they have their and deserve the rights to grow and have a better quality of life, education, healthcare. So all of those elements, we need to be able to empower those countries, don't we, for sure. So what do you think are some of the biggest myths about degrowth that you have seen? And I'm going to come on to ask you something in a moment about a particular individual, and I'll explain what I mean in a minute. But what are some of your big myths that you've heard and you just thought, no, that's just capitalism at its best?
So there's a few that you commonly hear. So degrowth is recession, degrowth is austerity, degrowth is cruel to people living in poverty, expecting them to degrow. Sort of that's that. Oh, and degrowth means we'll all go back to living in caves. Anything that, and most of these, it would take you 5 seconds to look up degrowth in Google and see that it's not any of those things. And if it was any of those things, why would there be a new term? Like, we wouldn't call it degrowth if it was recession. We'd just call it recession. And also, when it's just, it's insane to think that there'd be this huge movement of people calling for recession. Like, that's not what it is, and it's not austerity. And it's actually almost the opposite of those things. So austerity is it is cutting services that people need to live well, for the sake of the government debt sort of thing. Whereas degrowth is, let's provide those services to everyone. So healthcare, education, high quality public transport, still of I need more money because I need to be able to pay for all these things. So it's literally basically the opposite of austerity, and it's not recession, it's planned, whereas no one would plan a recession, obviously, and it's making sure that people's needs are met. It's frightening going to recession. You think it means unemployment and poverty and struggling and kind of human misery, whereas degrowth acknowledges that there's going to be a contraction of production and consumption, and therefore we need to make sure that people's needs are met as we go through that process. So it's not those things, and as I explained earlier, it's also not asking people in poverty to reduce their material footprint. It only applies to wealthy nations who are exceeding kind of planetary boundaries already. So I see those come up a lot, and it just makes me think, please do some research, because it's not that. Or, is it that are you trying to deliberately, tarnish the reputation of degrowth for whatever your own purpose is?
Yes. And I think that's where some of the truths start to come in, isn't it?
It's not any of those things.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess when you start to delve into the people or the corporations that are talking in that language, and then you look at the reasons and the rationale behind it and why, that's when you can really start to think, well, that's why you're saying it. And it's no different in the pharmaceutical industry, the chemical fertilizer industry, the fossil fuel industry, the amount of lobbying and PR and all of that. So anyway, that's another whole topic in its own right. So I was recently on a call, a group call with Tony Faddle, who was the guy who invented the iPhone and worked with Steve Jobs for many, many years. And I asked him the question, because I knew we were going to be talking about this actually. And I said, look, what's your view on degrowth? What does it mean to you? Do you believe in it? And I'll give you his response. I'd love to hear what you think. And actually, he said that it's more about redesign and waste. He said 60% of what we manufacture and make to consume is ultimately wasted through the supply chain. And then we have an inordinate amount of waste across the globe in consumer goods, foods, etc. So his view was that it was about creating minimal compromise and actually just cutting out those inefficiencies and waste. What do you think of that versus saying, no, we shouldn't have a degrowth plan?
Like, all those things should happen, and all of those things would happen in a degrowth economy. But probably something that in
Erin, the joys of live podcasting. Erin is in Sydney, so okay. Do you want to just repeat that last bit? Sorry, we lost you there for a little bit, Erin.
Yeah, so maybe something Tony hasn't considered is that energy isn't circular. So you might be able to recycle every single element of an iPhone, but the energy that went into the production of that iPhone, the energy that was used to charge that iPhone, whatever else, the signals that sent out for the iPhone to operate, once it's used, it's gone. And now where we're at with the climate crisis is that we're so close to even 2 degrees of warming. The amount of time we've got left to decarbonize versus how much time we've got left before we reach 2 degrees of warming. The greatest risk is that we don't have time to implement all the renewable energy that we need and continue to grow our energy use. So what we really need to do is to start thinking, do we need to be using all of this energy? Can we start to live with less energy?
Yeah.
We live happy, healthy lives with our decarbonisation objectives before we reach 2 degrees of warming. So that's the greatest risk now, is that we don't have time left to continue to grow our economies and deploy 100% renewable energy.
Because it does, to most people, that just feels like a complete contradiction. And one is kind of fearful, the other is just, kind of, we'll just keep going. It's not my problem, kind of kicking it down the road. But in terms of practical examples that I guess everyday people, what are some of the things that you've been doing with your family or your circle of influence to help on that journey?
Yeah, so I guess the thing with degrowth is that it has to be orchestrated, I guess, at a federal level. So as long as governments are pursuing GDP growth, so GDP is highly entangled with material footprint, including energy use. So what I would worry about is if I spent all my time trying to figure out how to reduce our energy use to zero, or our any energy associated with carbon emissions to zero, and then I'm not using that time to spread the degrowth word. And I can have so much more impact if I'm making more people aware that this is what needs to happen, rather than focus. It's a bit like if you're trying to achieve zero waste in your household, but it makes, very little difference because everyone else is still doing it. So it sort of has to be a systemic change. And there's something called the Jevons paradox, where for any energy you save, you sort of reinvest it. So you might find that fuel's cheaper, which doesn't mean you use less fuel. It means that you go further more often because now you can afford to use more fuel. And so you end up using more energy. And so for as long as, it's sort of related, but for as long as government's pursuing GDP growth, they'll literally throw money into different areas of the economy, wherever it might be. For Australia, it's a gas-fired recovery after COVID, but it might be aviation, it might even be renewable energy, but they'll keep throwing it in there to achieve their growth aspirations. So it has to happen at an orchestrated sort of global level. And that means that people who vote have to be wanting it. So we have to get the word of degrowth out there. So that's what I do. That's how I spend my time. And it means I'm not working. Like, I haven't found a role where I can do that every day. I know I'd be so frustrated going in and doing something that's not this at this point in time. So my husband's a bit like, I'm funding an activist. It's like, for the moment. You are for the moment.
That's exactly what you're doing.
Exactly. Because there's not much work out there for degrowth activists at this point in time. But I just look at my 3 kids and I just think, how can I not? Like, I have to do what I can.
And it's kind of being on the side of the solution rather than, and let's try and politely shame those that kind of aren't playing ball. But I think when you talk about that governmental shift, I know certainly here in the UK, deep down that it does come down a lot to the money and to the background and to the funding and all of those little backhanders that are going on, that we know are going on. Actually, here in the UK, the Green Party had its biggest ever kind of support in a local election point of view. Our general elections, I think next year, it's really bad, I can't remember, 2 years, sorry. And so there was a real shift, actually, not big enough to get hopes of, oh my god, the Green Party could win a general election, but it was actually really quite surprising from a UK point of view that there was that shift. So what can, we all as individuals in this space are probably doing things at home that a lot of people aren't, and it will start to feed down to your children and your circles around you. But what would you want the Australian government to implement to actually drive this systems change?
So we go to election next Saturday, so it's like 8 days away, and it's super exciting. And I've got a lot of friends in the climate movement, which is, it's wonderful because they're all actively involved in pushing for certain candidates. We've got big sort of pool of either of the major parties, but are running on a climate platform, because neither of our 2 major parties have emissions reductions targets in line with the science. Like, it's really disheartening. To see that, one of them has a minus 26 to 28% reduction by 2030, which is woeful, and the other one has minus 43% reduction by 2030. And like, the science is really clear that it needs to be minus 50%. And if you're a wealthy nation that's been putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere for a lot longer than a developing nation, then your target should be higher. So they're way off. And as part of sort of the election campaign, we've been meeting with candidates, and I literally meet with them. We have a coffee and I tell them everything I know about degrowth. And they obviously can't stand up in front of thousands of constituents and talk about degrowth yet. It's not there. But I don't think they need to use the word degrowth. I think they can just say, we're not focusing on GDP anymore. And GDP is a terrible measure of anything important, like literally. So we're going to focus on human well-being and, planetary well-being, because planetary well-being, it sounds airy-fairy. It's almost like, even the word greenie or environmentalist, like you feel a bit like you shouldn't say it because we're like, oh, you're just an environmentalist. But we can't live on a planet that can't sustain life. It's literally that crucial. So I think they could get up there and say, we're just not focusing on GDP. We're going to focus on making sure that we're achieving our climate ambitions, We're going to focus on alleviating poverty. We're going to focus on providing needs, and we're going to focus on the things that matter.
Yeah, because actually, if you look at all the sustainable development goals, it's not just carbon emissions and energy. It is about inequalities, poverty, raising living standards, water, life on below the water, above the water. So there are so many things to go at that if it's phrased in the right mind, lots of people around the world just want a better life. And I think COVID's really brought to the forefront the value and the importance of what matters now in life, while still being able to have a comfortable existence and a treat every now and again. And I think that's how it needs to be worded.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of things to like about degrowth. So degrowth being a planned reduction in production and therefore consumption, it means there's fewer things happening in the economy. It means there's fewer jobs. And so what we need to do when we do that is to cut the working week so that it's 30 hours a week or 4 days a week or something like that. So there's not many people that you go, hey, now we're doing a 4-day work week, a 3-day weekend, and people be like, oh, what? Are you kidding? Like, who wants an extra day off? That sucks. So, that there's that. And also another element of degrowth is to ensure that anyone who wants a job can get a job, and you can do that via a federal jobs guarantee. So it just means that anyone who wants to work, and because there's so much work to be done to mitigate climate change, there's so much we could be doing to protect natural environments, to insulate homes, to deploy renewable energy. There's just jobs galore, really. But it would be federally managed, so they would be making sure that anyone who wants to work can at a socially inclusive wage, which is much more than the minimum wage is now. So there's a lot of things to like about it. And there's a lot of time that would get freed up for people to enjoy doing things that's not work. So much of our time goes into work at the moment. Well, not me, because I don't. I'm working with
kids. You're a domestic engineer, so of 3 children.
My husband, I do the stuff that my husband can't do because he's at work a lot. And he would love to work a 4-day week, and he plans to when some of the big projects are over, because he knows that once the kids go to school, he won't get that time back again. So for him, the 4-day work week would be invaluable.
Yeah. And I think it's an interesting movement, because I mean, many years ago when I used to work at Red Bull, we always had Feature Friday, so we always finished at 1 o'clock on Friday. And it was brilliant, and it was just a thank you for the hard work that you've done that week. And I think that's transgressed now, and there's a lot more movement I've seen now about putting in plans around a 4-day week, because actually if you genuinely took out the hours wasted of chatting to your mates, having a good old bitch, meetings for meeting's sakes, and lack of inaction, there's an awful lot of inefficiency of your time in the workplace. So I genuinely believe you could drop to 4 days and people would still pump out the same amount of work, obviously, which is not what we want in terms of production and consumption. So I think that's really achievable. And like you say, that day a week that you then get, be that read a book, be it walk in nature, be it muck around with the kids, or be present, would be hugely invaluable.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some companies, I think Unilever in New Zealand have dropped back to a 4-day work week. It's happening in Iceland. I don't know the extent of the trial, but they've acknowledged that they can get the same sort of output in a 4-day work week, because there is a lot of inefficiencies in there. And people are happier. It's nice to have that extra day where you can make sure that the shopping's done and still enjoy your weekend. Like if you're working a 5-day week, your weekends are then sort of catching up and getting everything done so that you can go back and do your 5-day work week again without really getting to enjoy doing things like read books. It's hard to keep on top of some of the climate science if you're working a 40-hour work week and commuting 10 hours of that week as well. And then when you get home, you've got the kids. Like, it is no wonder people don't have time to concentrate on this stuff. There is little time. And I watched something interesting this week that talks about the inequality of time. And because it's got to do with how much you need to work to survive, leaves you little time to think about anything else. And it was really like, it's so true, and people who maybe they just employ their capital and that's where they get their income from, and they don't have to use their labor to get their income. They've got a lot more time on their hands for, whatever they'd like to use that time for. So that was an interesting kind of concept as well.
Yeah, I think that, like you say, I think if you were able to turn a switch off to remove everyone's financial constraints,
Yeah.
can you imagine what that would release? I think if you had that, like you say, a fair price for everyone to work. But look, I know that the top 2% of the wealth, holds an incredible amount of opportunity. And I've tried to kind of listen more about Elon Musk and embrace what he's trying to do with SpaceX, and focusing on trying to play around with the mind and the brain and help people live longer or after accidents and things like that. But I'm just not convinced. Why would you openly want to plan for 1,000 spaceships to live in a place that he openly says is going to be horrible? You might not live, you might not make the journey because of what might happen to planet Earth. Would it not therefore be better to redirect all that? Because he is a super intelligent guy. Why not direct that back into what could we do so that we never have to go and live on Mars?
Oh, I find it almost insane. Like, it's a hellhole. Why would anyone why would we even plan to live on Mars when we don't even know if it can sustain life? We've got this most magnificent planet, unlike any other planet in the entire universe, that has these beautiful mountains and these crystal clear rivers and, gorgeous glaciers, like anything, these beautiful beaches. It's amazing. Why wouldn't we focus all of our efforts on making sure it can sustain life? Why would we do that? It's so weird to me. I often think, if you've got some money laying around, give it to an activist, right? Like, give it to someone who can pay their rent and buy some food and then just go and, make noise and, whatever it might be, just up oil or whatever. That's where money needs to go at this point in time. And your return on investment can be keeping the planet habitable, like winning. That's that's awesome. I just don't understand. At this point in time, it's not about return on investment, because you're not going to care about your return on investment if in 2 decades time the world's 2 degrees warmer. We've activated all these tipping points and now it doesn't matter. So are you familiar with the tipping points?
Yeah, and actually we all talk about carbon, don't we? Well, the bigger one, is biodiversity loss and nitrogen. So actually there should be more into reducing the chemical fertilizers and the biodiversity loss that is driven by agricultural farming. Yeah, I mean, but not enough, like you say, not enough people are aware of it, or it's a little bit scaremongering, and so therefore I can't do anything about that, so I'll just ignore it, and everyone's focusing on carbon, and that's one of my frustrations.
Yeah, have you seen an image? It's titled Carbon Tunnel Vision. It's just this guy and he's just looking, and then it's like all the other problems around it. And the thing is, if you are solely focused on carbon, the solutions you put forward are going to be different than if you're looking at the full picture. And often, if you're just trying to solve carbon, the solutions you come up with will exacerbate the other problems. So I think it's really important to look at the full picture and all of the planetary boundaries that we're breaching. But back to the global tipping cascade, it's basically there's a point where we will activate tipping points in the Earth system. So, for example, the Amazon will tip from a rainforest to a savanna. Like, it's not going to overnight become a savanna, but there will be a point where it won't be a rainforest again. Doesn't matter what we do, over time it will become a savanna. We've already activated the tipping point for the Arctic, so we know now that there will be an ice-free summer, probably not till the 2030s, but whatever we do now, it's still going to happen. Like, we can't stop that melt in the Arctic. And there's permafrost release in the Arctic as well, and methane, which is coming out of permafrost, is so potent, something like over a 20-year period, 80 times more potent than carbon. So all these things that we're doing to the planet is just going to release way more greenhouse gases than whatever we're releasing. And once that happens, it doesn't matter what we do. So that's in my mind of where we need to work towards. So like once we activate that, it's too late. So we've got between now and that point in time, which no one knows where it is, but that's where the pressure point is for me.
For you, if I was to ask you, we will achieve 1.5% by 2030, what percentage would you put on that in us achieving it, with 0 being we haven't got a chance and 100% being we will do it?
1.5%. What do you mean? Or 1.5 degrees?
The 1.5 degrees.
Oh, yes, sorry. So we will do what we need to do to limit warming to 1.5 degrees.
By 2030.
Some research came out this week and it said that between, I think, 2024 and 2029 or something, there's a 50% chance that we'll reach 1.5 degrees. It might be temporary, but we'll get there. So like, I think it's gone. I genuinely think it's gone. I think our crunch point now is whether we can do it before 2 degrees of warming. And we're not going to do it like these sort of incremental targets that are really far away, that aren't really strong enough, that we're trying to achieve it with technology that doesn't exist, but we hope to get it there at some point in the future. Like, you're not taking climate seriously if that's what you're proposing. So climate envoy John Kerry, Biden's climate envoy John Kerry, he stood up and said, we're going to reduce our emissions by, I think their target's 50-ish% by 2030, and we're going to achieve it. He genuinely stood up and said, we're going to achieve it using technology that does not yet exist. It's like, what kind of risk profile is that? Like, if the technology doesn't exist, you put in plans to achieve it without the technology, and then if it comes into play, you can change the plan. But you just don't rely on technology that doesn't exist. Like, you can't. But I know they're scared to tell people that you might not be able to eat as much meat, because achieving those reduction targets means we can't have as many cows out there. And they're just scared. So another term I like to use is the Overton window. Are you familiar with the Overton window? It's like the window of politically permissible topics to talk about. So it's like it's political suicide if you want to talk about degrowth right now, right? So no one's doing it. It's political suicide if you want to tell Americans they can't eat as much meat, or Australians, to be fair. Maybe even British people as well, actually. It's political suicide to tell people that they can't drive, or that you're going to increase the cost of fuel, and all these things that we need to really genuinely do if we're going to keep the planet habitable. We can't talk about them yet, and it's a bit self-reinforcing, because these same leaders don't tell people how bad the state of the climate is. When the IPCC reports came out late last year and early this year, our Prime Minister didn't have a press conference and answer questions about it. Like, I think he pretty much hoped it would just fly under the radar, which it, pretty much did in the media, rather than get up and tell people, this is what we're doing, this is what we're planning, this is why it's important, and all those sorts of things. So then it becomes, people don't think it's a real problem, because the government, surely if it was that bad, the government would be talking about it. So they're not talking about it. So I'm not prepared to give up meat, and I'm not prepared to give up my car, and then all of a sudden you can't talk about these problems.
I think because we've had the 2 years of COVID, and then now we have the war in Europe. I think that's, COVID gave her a glimmer, and it gave an opportunity to talk about climate. And I think in a way the war has done that in Europe, because people are going, right, we need to be independent of Russia, certainly, but then actually just fossil fuels in general. So it's forced an agenda, which is horrific to think it's taken a war for those conversations to dial up. But like you say, I think it would be a brave politician when the cost of living crisis, I'm not sure what it's like in Australia, but in Europe, the UK and America, the cost of fuel, the cost of everything is so high that there's another 4 million families going in below the poverty line here in the UK. So how on earth do you then come out and say, this is what we're going to do? But that systems change and those people are responsible. And what can you and I do, and others listening? Yes, we can vote.
Yeah.
But how do we shift that change of denial?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So, and those, yeah, it goes back to degrowth isn't, it's not all deprivation, and climate policy isn't all deprivation either. So, genuinely, if your government was going to try and achieve the emissions reduction targets, they should be insulating all the homes, right? And they should be ensuring that these people can live without fossil fuels, and they should be making sure that everything's taken care of so that people can have, you know, a life of decency and not live in poverty. There's another policy lever, it's not quite policy perhaps, that I like, and it's modern monetary theory. And it just basically states that any currency issuing nation is never going to run out of money. And obviously you have to be careful with how you deploy that money, but it's not a scarce resource. What's scarce is, do we have the people on the ground to insulate every home in Britain? Do we have, you know, the resources to put enough renewable energy out there in time to avoid hitting kind of the 2 degrees of warming? You know, do we have what we need for all the public transport that we need to have available? They're your genuine resource constraints, but it's not money. So, you know, there's no reason why we can't look after these people and make sure they've got everything they need.
Yeah.
It's ideological that we're not at this point in time.
No, and it's, you know, even little things like we've looked into a heat pump and solar panels, but at the moment it's something like £28,000 if we want to put solar panels on. The heat pump is probably about a similar cost. Whereas, you know, my mother-in-law is just having solar panels fitted because she's over 70 and she earns under, you know, I think it's £30,000. So, but there's a lot of people in the UK who don't earn that amount of money, but they're not 70. So every policy that they put in to try and encourage you is against you from the start. And for most people who can find £50,000 to make their home, no one can. Not the majority.
No one can. But I mean, you don't even have to subscribe to modern monetary theory, because we are, I know in Australia, and I'm pretty sure it's the case for the British government as well, subsidizing fossil fuels to some ridiculous amount every hour of every day, of every week, of every year, over and over again. I think in Australia, it's something like $11 billion a year. It's, you know, insane amount of money. Imagine if they were subsidizing insulation and heat pumps and electrifying the entire grid so that you didn't have to make sure your house was electrified. You could just, not electrified, renewable. You didn't have to make sure that you had solar panels, because wherever you're getting your energy from was renewable anyway. You know, it's so, they can just, it doesn't take that much forethought to make it possible. You just need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels.
Yeah, and actually it'd be interesting. I don't know the figure, but if you took the subsidies for chemical fertilizers, fossil fuels, the indirect cost of biodiversity loss, I wonder what that figure would be per nation, to then, like you say, redeploy into providing jobs, insulating homes, rising inequality, you know, raising those inequalities. But I don't know. I feel like, as I'm sitting here talking to you, I feel like the answers are there. We all know it's cause related and it's systems changes that need to happen. We vote the people in to look after us, and they're not doing it. You know, when you see something like COVID, we react. The world reacted. The development countries were like giving out money and, oh, you just sit at home and we'll pay you, just don't go out. I feel like what's the systems crisis that's going to make them act like that?
And I guess with climate change, it's a slow burn. So we've known about Yeah, not so slow burn at the moment. We've known about it for decades, so there's no, whereas COVID kind of had that sense of urgency, it's coming, it's in Italy now, look what it's doing, it's here. But actually there's climate change has just been in the background forever, and there's no point, sort of pinch point that will make governments act differently at this point. Look, I know people who think it will take a really devastating event that might make people wake up. And I hate to think that's what it will take, but maybe. There's a wet bulb event. Have you heard of that?
No, what bulb did you say?
Yeah, so it's taking the temperature of an environment, a city, with a wet towel around the temperature bulb, the thermostat, and that from what I understand, it takes account of humidity as well. And when the wet bulb temperature gets to 35 degrees, it's too hot for the human body to cool itself through sweat, and the human body can't cool. So if you experience that temperature and that humidity, 35 degrees, for extended time, 4 to 6 hours, you don't have the luxury of air conditioning, you won't survive. And that could wipe out, it's catastrophic to think of if that happened in a big country like India or Pakistan or whatever, how many people.
It's happening right now, isn't it? When you look at India,
they had massive heat waves last week, and I think again
did it top 60 degrees or didn't it get to 61? Or
I don't know if it got that hot, but they were fortunate in that they didn't have the high humidity at that time, so the wet bulb wasn't that high. I haven't read Ministry of the Future, but apparently the opening chapter of that book is about a wet bulb event where kind of sort of millions of people die. And the other thing that I worry about is like a global food shortage. I don't know if it happened in the UK, but at the start of COVID, there were people fighting over toilet paper. And I was like,
oh yes, we had people literally ransacking toilet roll. I don't know why they thought COVID was going to make you have a bad bottom, but it was ridiculous.
The one thing you don't want to run out of was toilet paper. But imagine when they're fighting over bread and pasta and rice and some of those staples, it's not going to be pretty at all. And it won't, it's horrible because this affects lots of countries already. There's food shortages in lots of countries, but it hasn't really affected the Western sort of wealthy nations yet. But, it's only a matter of time.
Yeah, and I think it's, again, unfortunately, because of the situation in Ukraine, that is starting to happen. So the animal feed isn't being produced, so then the price of meats are going up. We aren't getting the amount of, certainly chickens and beef, etc., but also all of our staple goods like your pastas and your rice and your tinned tomatoes, they've all gone up between 20 and 120%. Wow. So I think the combination here with sort of Brexit, COVID, war, it is having massive impacts. And I think the food shortage is one that you're rightly to bring up, because in the next 12 to 18 months, along with the temperatures rising in Africa and India and countries that are growing goods, they're not seeing that growth at all. There's no produce at all. But unfortunately, as we're talking about reduction in production, we don't necessarily mean the raw essentials of food, do we?
Sorry, I missed that last bit. I had a bad internet.
We don't necessarily mean the raw essentials of food, and those countries that do produce a lot of it are struggling and suffering from direct climate, weather.
Yeah. And even the IPCC, when they release their reports, they talk about the chances of breadbasket failure in multiple regions at the same time each year. So, by the mid-2030s, there could be multiple regions across the world suffering, wheat harvest problems. wheat goes into everything. And if there's a wheat shortage in Australia, and there's a wheat shortage in Ukraine, and there's a wheat shortage in, Midwest America, how do we meet what we need? And if it happens for a few years in a row and we don't have anything in storage or kind of in any stock as backup, what do you do? How do you feed the world's population? We've had a stable climate for roughly 10,000 years, and that's what's enabled modern agriculture as we know it. And now we're messing with that climate. And that's the thing that worries me almost the most is food. And how nasty people are going to get when they need food, and how do we grow food in cities? How do you do that?
Yeah, and you know what? And again, there's some incredible examples. Singapore is one of them. They are striving to be the greenest city. It is a phenomenal place, and I think we can grow things in cities. There are some amazing, vertical farming. We're producing more things in the UK, for example, but under solar panels, so that we don't have to import unseasonal fruits. I think the knowledge, the skills, the indigenous knowledge, it's all there for the taking. It's such a huge topic. But yeah,
and it's planning could be done, but there's no really coordinated, integrated planning happening. And as you start to do all the things we need to do to address climate change, like use cars less, that frees up car parks that could then be used to become communal gardens and that sort of thing, even community spaces, and can be maybe rewilded. There's all these amazing things we could do if we started to take it seriously and not just, kick the can down the road for some other leader who's elected at some other time to deal with, which is sort of how it feels like it's being managed at this point in time.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, listen, I'm sure we could go on and on and on for many months, actually, talking like this. But let's try and end on a kind of a vision for the future. What vision would you like to see for the planet and for your kids and my kids and everyone else?
Yeah, I think that I really feel, and there's something that I feels most profound when I'm reading all the things I'm reading, is that in a lot of respects, we've forgotten what it means to be human. So we've forgotten how to be artists and how to be creative and how to use our imagination and how to be idle. This feeling that we need to be busy all the time and productive, and we don't, we don't pass down lessons anymore, or knowledge between generations. And I just think that's a beautiful thing to recapture, and just spending time together and having those really great memories, that because they just were hanging out together, it wasn't just always, I don't know, I think we've lost some spontaneity and some connection, even connection with nature. I love it most when my kids are at the beach and just playing and being outside and doing things kids should do. So when I think about what I want the future to be, I want that return to simplicity and that feeling that enough is enough, not that it has to be more, that enough is content, provides contentment, just having enough. So that's something that I strive to instill in my children and hope that we can realize in the future.
I think that's a beautiful ending, and I think it's been an absolute pleasure chatting through some of these challenges that we have. And listen, thank you so much for joining me all the way down under in Sydney. I know you've got a glass of wine hiding down there, so you can enjoy that glass of wine now. I'm going to go get a cup of tea. But listen, thank you so much, Erin, and I'll speak to you soon. Take care. So that's it. You've made it. The show's over. Thank you for being with us. I hope you've been able to take something away, maybe solve a problem, or just know you're not alone. Here's hoping it made you smile with a few laughs along the way. Please feel free to find me on all social media channels, and you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just search the Road and Morale podcast. Have an awesome day and see you next time.